They said I was marrying a blind beggar to settle my stepmother's debts. The whole village laughed at me walking down that aisle. But when my husband's eyes finally opened 3 months later, he looked at me and whispered 5 words that changed everything. Pack your bags, we're going home. If you've ever felt invisible, unwanted, or counted out, this story is for you. Stay until the very end, because the biggest twist will blow your mind. And please, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you don't want to miss what happens next. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Thandiwi, and I'm 22 years old. Well, I'm 25 now, but I was 22 when all of this happened. I need to take you back to understand how a girl like me ended up in a situation like that. See, I wasn't always the scared, broken girl being sold off like cattle. I had parents once. I had a home where I was loved. My father was a school teacher, and my mother sold vegetables at the market. We weren't rich, but we had enough. More than enough, actually, because we had each other. Then one rainy night, when I was 15, a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. My parents were coming home from visiting my grandmother in the next town. They never made it. The police came to our door at midnight, and just like that, my whole world collapsed. I had no siblings, no grandparents left on my father's side. My mother's mother was too old and sick to take me in, so my father's younger brother, Uncle Joseph, stepped up. He brought me to his home in the city, and for 1 year, I felt safe again. Uncle Joseph was kind. He treated me like his own daughter, but God had other plans, I suppose. Uncle Joseph had a heart attack at work and died instantly. I was 16 years old and orphaned twice. His wife, Aunt Beatrice, became my legal guardian. And that's when my life became a living nightmare. You see, Aunt Beatrice never wanted me there in the first place. She had 2 daughters of her own, Precious and Grace, and in her eyes, I was just an extra mouth to feed. Within a month of Uncle Joseph's death, I went from being treated like family to being treated like a servant. I cooked every meal. I cleaned every room. I washed everyone's clothes by hand, while Precious and Grace went to parties and came home at midnight expecting hot food waiting for them. I did all of this while still trying to go to school, but eventually, Aunt Beatrice pulled me out completely. She said there was no money for my school fees, even though Precious and Grace went to private schools. I watched my dreams of becoming a nurse fade away as I spent my days scrubbing floors and my nights crying into my thin pillow on the storage room floor. Yes, the storage room. That's where I slept for 6 years. Not even a proper bedroom, just a small space with boxes and a mat on the concrete floor. But I survived. I told myself that one day I'd escape. One day I'd save enough money and leave that house forever. Except I never got paid for any of the work I did. Aunt Beatrice said room and food were my payment. Room and food. As if the storage room and leftover scraps were some kind of blessing I should be grateful for. Everything changed one Thursday night. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard loud voices coming from the living room. 3 men had entered our house, and Aunt Beatrice was crying. I dried my hands and crept closer to listen. The men were debt collectors, and they weren't the polite kind. One of them, a large man with a deep voice, was telling Aunt Beatrice that she owed him $2 million, and he wanted his money tonight. $2 million. I nearly gasped out loud. How could she owe that much money? Turns out, Aunt Beatrice had a gambling problem nobody knew about. She'd been betting on everything from card games to sports matches, always convinced the next win would solve all her problems. Instead, she'd borrowed from the wrong people, and now they wanted their money back with interest. Aunt Beatrice was on her knees begging for more time. The man, who introduced himself as Mr. Okonkwo, said time was up. Then his eyes landed on me standing in the doorway. He looked me up and down like I was merchandise, and I felt my skin crawl. "How old is this one?" he asked. Aunt Beatrice wiped her tears and looked at me with something cold in her eyes, something calculating. "She's 22. My late husband's niece." Mr. Okonkwo nodded slowly, then smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. I have a nephew, he said. Young man, about 27 years old. He's blind. Been blind for 5 years now. He needs a wife to take care of him. You give me the girl, and we'll call the debt settled. All of it. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Surely Aunt Beatrice would say no. Surely she wouldn't actually sell me to settle her gambling debts. But when I looked at her face, I saw the answer before she even spoke. When do you need her? She asked. Those 4 words broke something inside me. I started screaming, telling her she couldn't do this, that Uncle Joseph would be ashamed of her. I begged and cried and pleaded. Aunt Beatrice stood up and slapped me so hard I tasted blood. You ungrateful girl, she hissed. After everything I've done for you, you can't do this one thing for the family. I tried to run. I made it to the front door before 2 of the men grabbed me and dragged me to the storage room. They locked me inside, and I heard Aunt Beatrice tell them the wedding would happen in 3 days. 3 days. I was being given 3 days to accept that my life was over. I screamed until my voice gave out. I pounded on the door until my hands were bruised. Nobody came. For 2 days, Aunt Beatrice kept me locked in that room with barely any food or water. By the 3rd day, I had no fight left in me. I was empty, defeated. When she finally opened the door and told me to get dressed, I just nodded. The wedding was a joke. No church, no guests, just a quick ceremony at the magistrate's office. I wore the same dress I wore to church on Sundays, a faded blue thing that had seen better days. Aunt Beatrice was there, looking relieved that her debts were cleared. Mr. Okonkwo and his men stood in the corner, watching everything like guards. And then there was him, Kofi, my husband, the blind pauper I was being forced to marry. He was tall and lean, with dark skin and a quiet presence. He wore sunglasses even though we were indoors, and he held a white walking stick. His clothes were old but clean and neatly pressed. When the magistrate told him to say his vows, his voice was gentle and calm. He said, "I do," like he actually meant it, like this wasn't some transaction, but a real marriage. I could barely choke out my own vows through my tears. When it was over, Kofi reached out his hand to me. "Shall we go home, Thandiwe?" he asked softly. Home. What a cruel word. We walked through town together, and people stared. They whispered and pointed. Poor Thandiwe, married off to a blind beggar. What a shame. What a waste. I wanted to disappear into the ground. Kofi seemed unbothered by the stares. He walked with his stick in one hand and my arm in his other, guiding me even though I was supposed to be guiding him. When we finally reached his place, I was expecting the worst, a shack with a leaking roof and dirt floors. But what I found surprised me. It was a small house, yes, but it was solid and clean. 2 rooms, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom that actually worked. The furniture was simple, but well made. Everything had its place, organized in a way that made sense for someone who couldn't see. Kofi led me inside and immediately told me I could have the bedroom. He would sleep on the couch in the main room. I stared at him, confused. "I know you didn't choose this, Thandiwe," he said quietly. "I won't make it harder for you than it already is. You're safe here, I promise." That night, I lay in bed in a stranger's house, married to a man I'd met hours ago, and I cried myself to sleep. But somewhere in my heart, a tiny seed of hope planted itself. Because Kofi had been kind, and kindness was something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. The days that followed were strange. I fell into a routine of cooking and cleaning, the same tasks I'd done at Aunt Beatrice's house. But everything felt different here. Kofi thanked me for every meal. He asked me how I slept, if I needed anything, if I was comfortable. He treated me like a person, not a servant. We'd sit together in the evenings, and he'd tell me stories about his life. He said he'd been blinded in an accident 5 years ago and had been living alone ever since. He made money by carving wooden sculptures and selling them at the market. I watched him work one afternoon, and I was amazed. His hands moved over the wood with such confidence and precision. He created birds and flowers and human faces with incredible detail. How can you do this without seeing? I asked him. He smiled. I see with my hands. I see with my heart. Sometimes that's clearer than seeing with your eyes. I didn't understand what he meant then, but I would later. As weeks passed, I started noticing strange things. When we went to the market, the shopkeeper always gave Kofi extra items for free. On the house, he'd say with a knowing smile. The pastor from the local church visited every week with baskets of food, calling them blessings. Well-dressed men in expensive cars would stop by occasionally, handing Kofi envelopes that I knew contained money. When I asked about it, Kofi just said they were old friends helping out. But something didn't add up. These weren't the kinds of friends a poor blind woodcarver would have. Then there was his phone. It rang constantly, and Kofi always stepped into the other room to take calls. Through the thin walls, I'd hear him speaking in a completely different tone. Authoritative, businesslike, using words like quarterly reports and investment returns in board meetings. What kind of blind pauper talked like that? I wanted to ask him directly, but part of me was afraid of what the answer might be, afraid that if I pushed too hard, his kindness would disappear. But despite my confusion and suspicions, something unexpected was happening. I was falling in love with my husband. Kofi made me laugh with his terrible jokes. He listened when I talked about my parents and my pain. He shared his own story of being orphaned as a child, of understanding what it felt like to be alone in the world. We cooked together, with me describing ingredients and him adding spices by touch and smell. We took evening walks, my hand on his arm, talking about everything and nothing. One night, about 3 months into our marriage, we were sitting outside under the stars. Well, I was looking at the stars. Kofi was just sitting with his face turned upward. "Tell me what you see," he said. I described the sky, the moon, the patterns of stars. Then he reached over and took my hand. "I may not see you, Thandiwi," he said softly, "but I feel your beautiful spirit. I hear your kindness in every word. I know your heart, and it's the most beautiful thing I've ever known." My heart nearly burst. In that moment, I didn't care about the strange phone calls or the mysterious visitors. I loved this man, this gentle, kind, mysterious man, who saw me in ways nobody ever had. The next morning, everything changed. We were walking to the market when a child ran into the street chasing a ball. A car was speeding down the road, and the driver wasn't paying attention. Everything happened so fast. Kofi suddenly released my arm and sprinted forward. Not walked, not stumbled, sprinted. With perfect precision and vision, he grabbed the child and rolled to safety, shielding the boy with his own body. The car screeched past, missing them by inches. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, my mind unable to process what I'd just witnessed. Kofi stood up, dusted himself off, and handed the crying child to his mother. Then he turned toward me, and our eyes met. Actually met. He was looking directly at me, seeing me, his dark glasses slightly crooked on his face. "Kofi," I whispered, my voice shaking. You can see." The crowd that had gathered went silent. Kofi reached up slowly and removed his sunglasses completely. His eyes were clear and sharp and looking right into mine. "Yes," he said quietly, "I can see." I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran. My mind was spinning with betrayal and confusion and anger. He'd been lying to me. For 3 months, he'd been lying. Everything was a lie. Kofi caught up to me quickly, because of course he could. He could see perfectly fine. He grabbed my arm gently. "Thandiwe, please, let me explain." I yanked my arm away. "Explain? Explain what?" "That you've been pretending to be blind. That everything about you is a lie. What kind of sick game is this?" We went back to the house, and Kofi sat me down. He took a deep breath and told me everything, and I mean everything. His real full name was Kofi Mensah. His family owned the largest diamond mining operation in our country and 2 neighboring countries. They were worth over $800 million. I actually laughed when he said that because it was so absurd. $800 million. The blind pauper I married was worth $800 million. 5 years ago, Kofi explained, someone tried to kill him. His cousin, working with corrupt business partners, had poisoned his drink at a company dinner. The goal was to eliminate him and take control of the family business. The poison didn't kill him, but it damaged his optic nerves and left him completely blind. The doctors said it might be permanent, or it might heal over time. There was no way to know, so Kofi made a decision. He would disappear. He would live as a blind man with nothing, and see who remained loyal to him, see who in his circle actually cared about him versus his money. Mr. Okonkwo, the supposed loan shark, was actually his head of security. The entire debt situation with Aunt Beatrice had been real on her end. But Mr. Okonkwo worked for Kofi. They'd been looking for someone genuine, someone with a good heart who'd been tested by life, someone who would care for a blind man with nothing to gain. "I watched you, Thandiwe," Kofi said, his eyes intense. "For weeks before we even met, I had people tell me about you. The orphan girl treated like a slave, but who still smiled at children in the street, who shared her lunch with stray dogs even when she barely had enough for herself, who never stole or complained even when she had every right to." He continued, his voice soft but firm. "When you married me, I was still blind, but 6 weeks ago, my vision started coming back. Slowly at first, then completely. I kept pretending because I needed to know something. I needed to know if you could love me. Not my money, not my status, just me. The man who carved wood and told bad jokes and held your hand under the stars." I sat there, my emotions at war with each other. I was angry at the deception, but I also understood it. In his position, wouldn't I want to know if someone loved me for me? "You should have told me when your vision returned," I said finally. He nodded. "You're right. I was selfish. I was falling in love with you. And I was afraid that if you knew the truth, everything would change, that you'd see me differently. I'm sorry, Thandiwe. I'm so sorry." I looked at this man, really looked at him. Whether he was blind or sighted, poor or rich, he was still the same person who'd shown me kindness when the world had shown me cruelty. He was still the man who made me feel seen when I'd been invisible my whole life. "I fell in love with Kofi the woodcarver," I said slowly. "The man who thanked me for every meal and asked about my dreams. Are you still that man?" He reached for my hands. "I'll always be that man. The money doesn't change who I am in here." He placed my hand over his heart. "Can you forgive me?" I thought about everything I'd been through, the loss, the abuse, the forced marriage, and how all of it had led me to this moment, to this man. "Yes," I whispered, "I forgive you." We held each other and cried together, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly at home. The next day, Kofi took me to his real home. I wasn't prepared. The estate was massive, with gates and guards and gardens that seemed to stretch forever. The main house had 15 bedrooms, a pool, and staff who greeted Kofi as Mr. Mensa, sir. I walked through marble hallways in a daze, touching expensive furniture and staring at crystal chandeliers. This was my life now. It didn't feel real. News spread fast in our small country. Within a week, everyone knew that the poor orphan girl had married a secret billionaire. Aunt Beatrice showed up at the estate gates, crying and begging to see me. She brought Precious and Grace, who suddenly wanted to reconnect with their dear sister, the same sister they'd treated like dirt for 6 years. Kofi wanted to have them removed from the property, but I stopped him. I went down to the gate and looked at Aunt Beatrice. She was smaller than I remembered, older and worn down by life. "Please, Thandawi," she begged. "I'm sorry for everything. I was wrong. We're family, please." I felt Kofi's hand on my shoulder, supporting whatever decision I made. I thought about becoming like her, bitter and vengeful. I thought about how hate only breeds more hate. "I'm going to pay off your real debts," I told her, "all of them. And I'm going to give you enough money to start over. But after today, we're done. I won't become the person you were, but I also won't forget what you did. Goodbye, Aunt Beatrice." I walked back into the estate and never looked back. That was 3 years ago. Today, Kofi and I have a beautiful 1-year-old daughter named Ayana. She has her father's eyes and my smile. I run a foundation for orphaned children, making sure no child ever feels invisible or unwanted the way I did. We've built 3 homes for orphans and funded education for over 200 children. Kofi returned to running the family business, and his cousin is in prison for the poisoning attempt. Sometimes I think about how a forced marriage to a blind pauper became the greatest blessing of my life, how the worst moment led to the best outcome. Kofi didn't fall in love with my beauty or my status because I had neither. He fell in love with my heart, and I fell in love with his, not knowing he was wealthy, just knowing he was kind. That's the kind of love that lasts. That's the kind of love that changes everything. So that's my story. From orphan to housemaid, to the wife of a billionaire, but more importantly, from invisible to seen, from unloved to cherished. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what you would have done in my situation. Would you have forgiven Kofi for pretending to be blind? Would you have given Aunt Beatrice that money? I read every single comment. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and turn on that notification bell because I share real stories like this every week. Stories about real people, real struggle, and real triumph. Thank you for listening to my story. Until next time, remember, you are never invisible to those who truly matter. God bless you all.